About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with me. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's live stream for GCSE Geography, and it's going to be led this evening by Vicky and Suzanne. Great to see some of you joining us live this evening. If you are joining us live, there'll be activities during the session which you can join in with by typing into the live chat window. We also know there are many more of you that join us on catch up, and if you're watching not live, obviously you can't join in on the live chat window, but you might be able to pause some of the activities and have a little bit longer to answer some of them. Vicky, do you want to tell us a bit about this evening's session?
Yep, so last week we covered the causes of climate change. So this week we're going to have a look at how to mitigate and adapt to climate change, which is part of the Natural Hazards Unit and obviously is very topical as well. So hopefully it will be very useful for your upcoming mocks that you might have after February half term.
Great stuff. Shall we get cracking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds
good. Let's get going.
Perfect. So we're going to kick off this evening with some altered vowels, which hopefully you've come across before. So you're going to see lots of different key phrases on the screen. We will give you a few moments to try and work those out, and each of the vowels has been changed to a different one. Okay, and they're all to do with climate change. So can we have the first one up, please, Duncan? Super. So a nice, easy one to get us started. So what do we think this one might be? So if you can pop it into the chat window. Let's have a think what this might be. Okay, we'll give you just another moment to get your ideas into the chat window. If you need a little bit more time, if you're watching it on catch up, then obviously you can pause whenever you like. Okay, so a nice easy one. Well done, those of you that are having a go at this one. Duncan, can we have the correct answer up, please? Excellent. It is fossil fuels. Well done. And hopefully we all know why they are being looked at in this session. Obviously, that's something that we are trying to use less and less. Okay, can we have the next one up, please? Okay, so we have our second one up. So we remember our focus this evening is on mitigation and adaptation. So think about that when you're trying to work out the altered vowels. Hopefully the first word is nice and easy. The second one may be a little bit more tricky. Okay. So what do we think this one might be? So we had a couple of right answers for the first one. Is there anybody willing to have a guess on this one? So this is a way of mitigating climate change. Duncan, can we have the correct answer up on the screen, please? It is carbon capture. We're going to talk about this a bit later. Well done, Pink, for getting that correct in the chat window. Excellent work. Okay, can we have the next one up, please? Right. This one I think looks really confusing, and for a moment I just thought I can't even remember what it is now, but I remember exactly what this one is. Again, another mitigation strategy. What do we think this one might be? So slightly more tricky, lots of vowels in this one. I'll give you a clue. This one starts with A. So it's oh, not deforestation. Pink, think about the opposite of deforestation. So good guess, but think about the opposite. Okay, Duncan, can we have the answer on the screen? It is afforestation. So again, we'll talk about that and why it's important a bit later on in this session. Can we have the next one up, please, Duncan? Okay. Now this one, again, quite tricky, I think. Again, lots and lots of vowels, particularly in the second word. Think about some of the things that countries do every few years to try and agree targets for climate change. So this one is a really important thing to do with those international treaties. So we've got some late coming answers from the previous one coming up on the screen. Well done, those of you who got afforestation. So what do we think this one might be? This took place in 2015, to give you a clue. It took place in a capital city in Europe. Okay, Duncan, can we have the correct answer up? This is the Paris Agreement. So remember, we had COP26 back in October last year. That was looking at the carbon targets that had been made at the Paris Agreement. And it was a really groundbreaking, really important agreement that lots of countries had signed to finally make proper plans to try and mitigate as much, those carbon emissions as much as possible. Again, we'll talk about it a bit later. Right, last one up, please, Duncan. Super. So this one is a phrase that we've heard a lot recently. So hopefully it's quite easy because they're both really short words. We heard a lot about it in the Paris Agreement, but more so at COP26. What do we think this one might be? Let's give you just a couple of moments. So lots and lots of the COP26 talks were talking about how to get to this. Well done, Damas. It is net zero. Excellent. Again, we'll talk about that a bit later. So I'm going to hand over to Suzanne just to run through very quickly what we are going to cover in this session this evening.
Thank you, Vicky. Okay, so we are going to be looking at the part of the specification which focuses on how to mitigate climate change and how to adapt to the impacts of climate change. However, firstly, we need to talk about some of the social, economic and environmental impacts of climate change, those which have already happened and those which are likely to happen in the future, so those that are predicted. So we know how we might be able to adapt in the future. We will then cover mitigation, and you can see there reducing carbon emissions through alternative energy, carbon capture, afforestation and international agreements, and they're listed in the AQA syllabus. Before looking at the adaptations, again, directly from your syllabus, changing farming, managing water supply, and reducing risk from rising sea levels. So a great session tonight, and I'm going to let you go over to Vicky for a very exciting connection spinner game.
Excellent, thank you very much. So rather than go through the impacts that have already been felt across the world due to climate change and those that might actually occur in the future, we're going to get you to think about these. So the connection spinner is a really good activity and it gets you to apply your own knowledge, and hopefully we all know that application of knowledge is a key assessment objective at GCSE, and you won't access those higher bands in level mark questions if you don't apply some of your knowledge. So we're going to show you some different things that will be impacted by climate change, and you just need to explain how. So what will happen is we'll spin the spinner and it will randomly land on one of those on the screen, and we would like you to tell us how that will be impacted by climate change. Try and get those ideas down in the chat window. Now, if you're watching this on catch up or sorry, on replay, then obviously give yourself a bit more time by pausing it whenever you need to. So Duncan, can we have the first spin, please? Okay, so we have landed on coral reefs. Now, these are already being impacted by climate change and they will continue to do so. So let's have a think about how coral reefs are being affected by climate change. So what is climate change doing to those, and how and why? So have a think. Think maybe about, you know, the biodiversity those coral reefs have. Think about the oceans that they're in, what might happen. Just give you a couple of moments to get some ideas into that chat window. Okay, if you are watching on catch up, then pause the video now. Well done, we've got some answers coming through. So Damas, excellent. So less coral reefs leading to less fish habitats, decreasing the fish stock. That's an excellent argument there. Well done. Can we have the some ideas up onto the screen? So hopefully we know that the Great Barrier Reef is the world's biggest coral reef. That will see biodiversity loss. That warmer acidic water would cause coral bleaching. So when you see pictures of coral that's completely white, that's coral bleaching. It's caused by a rise in the temperature of the sea, and once coral reefs get bleached, they're effectively dead. They can't recover from that. And well done, Pink, you've just said pretty much exactly what I've just said on the screen. So fantastic, really good contribution there. Duncan, can we have a second spin, please? Okay, this time we're landing on health. I was really hoping it wasn't going to land on coral reefs again. So the same thing. So if you're watching on catch up, pause, give yourself a bit more time. Those of you that are watching live, have a think about the impacts of climate change on health. So maybe think about the hot weather, but also think about perhaps the idea that we might have colder weather in some places. Have a little think. Again, we'll give you a few moments to get your ideas into the chat. You can think about it from an HIC and LIC point of view with this one. Super. So we've got an answer, brilliant answer coming through. So Pink said health, natural disasters such as tsunamis may have increased a rate, and extreme heat may cause more droughts. Well, some really good ideas there. Tsunamis are not going to increase because of climate change, but things like storm surges because of tropical storms possibly will. So Duncan, can we have some ideas up on the screen, please? So if we think about Europe in particular, we might get more heat waves. So some of you might have studied the heat wave of 2003, which killed about 20,000 people right across Europe. But you also might have the people that die because of the cold, that may actually decrease. So at the moment, it's really topical at the moment. We've had lots of stories in the news with energy price rises over the last couple of weeks, and stories of older people that can't afford to heat their homes. This makes people very ill over the winter, so perhaps that will decrease. But we've also got areas across Africa, for example, in the southeast, where malaria might unfortunately increase because it's much more hot and humid, and it will stay that way for longer in the year. So obviously those conditions that mosquitoes thrive on will be around for much longer. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Suzanne, who's going to do a couple more with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Vicky. Right, Duncan, can we give it another spin? And let's hope we don't get the ones that Vicky's already done. Wonderful. Where is it going to land? Whoa. Oh, just fantastic. Right, tourism. So have a think about what impacts climate change might have on tourism and pop it into the chat box. And obviously, if you're watching at home later, you can pause to write down your answers. So I want to see, I've seen some great stuff coming up so far to Vicky's impact. So I'd like to see some, have a think about tourism. So think about the different areas where tourism might be affected by climate change. What might alter? What kind of places do you think rely on certain types of weather conditions? February half term is a time when some people actually go up to or go off on holiday to do an activity. Also, if you think about the Beijing winter games at the moment. Right, let's see. Have we got anything? Anyone's going to pop anything down? Right, I think, Duncan, shall we have a look? Okay. Oh, I've got some. Yes, thank you very much, Pink. Great stuff. Yes, we are going to certainly have warming. So, absolutely. Rising sea levels making beaches flood. Great stuff. Right, let's have a look, please, Duncan. Thank you. So, I was thinking, first of all, of some of those skiing tourist resorts. And I know sometimes that they are getting a little bit warmer. Sometimes the season's quite short because they've actually had less snow. And I think it can also impact sometimes on kind of the chances of avalanches. And there are some very tourism dependent places, such as the Maldives, which we'll also be talking about later, which are a group of very low lying islands. Well, some of those are actually going to disappear. They'll be underwater by 2050, the predictions suggest. So the impacts are quite severe for some of those tourist areas. There are some small arguments. There are some locations that might benefit and become slightly warmer, but I think it's definitely outweighed by the negative impacts of climate change on many of those tourist resorts. Right, let's have a go, Duncan, again, and hope we've got 3 gone, so let's hope we don't get those again. Let's hope it's fishing, flood risk, or crop yield. Where are we going to land? Ooh, phew. Right, fishing. So have a think about the impacts of climate change on fishing, on the fishing industry. So again, if you're watching at home later, you can pause. And if you're playing with us now, have a go and pop some stuff into the chat box. So think, what might happen to the fishing? In some ways, it's linked a little bit to what Vicky was talking about with those coral reefs, thinking about some of those breeding grounds potentially. So what might happen to fishing industry? There we go. Oh, well done. I've got some answers coming down. Wonderful. Right, you've got the right idea there, Pink. Right, let's have the answer, please. So we've got fishing going into decline. So somewhere like the lower Mekong Delta, you can see there in Southeast Asia, it will affect 40 million people. Because there will be a reduced water flow and sea level rise, which will change the quality of the water, which will mean that it will reduce the fish stocks. And of course, thinking about those coral reefs that are vital breeding grounds, if we have more of those reefs being destroyed or bleached, then we're going to have a reduction in the areas which fish can breed. So overall, decline. However, we may find that some fish species are able to migrate slightly further north. But I think overall the quantity in some of those very densely populated areas of the world that rely on fishing will be severely affected. Right, okay, I think we are now, on back to Vicky.
Perfect, thank you. So we're going to have a talk about mitigation and adaptation now. So when we think about fighting climate change, the challenge of reducing the impact of climate change can be managed by these two approaches. So mitigation, which is reducing or preventing the greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere in the first place. So we can have strategies on a global, national or a local scale that we're going to have a talk about. And adaptation is the idea of trying to respond to the impacts of climate change. So adapting your way of life and trying to make the populations a bit less vulnerable. Now, these strategies tend to be much more on a local scale. So can I have the next slide up, please, Duncan? So I'm going to talk to you firstly about mitigation, then Suzanne's going to talk to you about adaptation. So our first way that we can mitigate alternative energy is through the use of is through the use of alternative energy. So we know that as our population increases and income increases, we're going to have a much higher demand for energy. So we need that energy to power consumer goods like refrigeration, computers, cars. We want to travel around the world a bit more, but also to produce food, particularly meat. So this causes a massive challenge for climate change. Now, the burning of fossil fuels helps us obviously produce energy, they fuel vehicles and they power industry, but this contributes 87% of all human produced CO2 emissions. So as a result, countries are trying to use alternative sources of energy, and there are lots of them, so things like hydroelectric power, nuclear power, solar, wind, tides, all sorts of things there. And these are much better because they don't emit large amounts of CO2, and some of them are renewable, so they will last into the future. Not all of them. So nuclear power, for example, is not renewable. It uses uranium to generate electricity, but it doesn't emit CO2 as a byproduct like lots of the others. Now, renewable energy sources are generally quite expensive. So solar energy, for example, it's more expensive than using fossil fuels, but they are becoming cheaper and they are becoming more competitive. And obviously they don't emit CO2, so they are a really important part of our fight against climate change. Lots of people have invested in solar panels in their homes, so quite a small scale. So when the light shines on the solar panel, it creates electric field here. The stronger the sunshine on solar panels, obviously the more electricity that's produced. So they are really good in some countries, maybe more so than in the UK. Now, if we think about on the screen, we've got a offshore wind farm in a country like the UK where we're surrounded by the sea. Offshore wind farms are brilliant. Now, over the next few days, we are expecting hugely speedy winds coming through to the UK. So there'll be a real potential there for that electricity generation. Now, at the bottom of the screen, there is a hyperlink for the National Grid Live status. And obviously we can't click on that at the moment, but you can download the PowerPoint presentation from the website. And that's really interesting because it does change every single day. So it tells you exactly what percentage of electricity is being generated by fossil fuels, by wind, by solar, etc. every single day. And it changes because obviously if we think about our weather, we have different hours of sunlight. We get much more from solar power in the summer. On a really windy day, we might get 30%, for example, of our energy. And if I looked at this at the weekend when I was putting this together, on Sunday, we had 36.8% of energy from renewables. And again, mainly that was wind because it was quite breezy at the weekend. Perfect. Duncan, can you please pop the next one? Okay. So we have got mitigation, carbon capture and storage is on the screen this time. So we hopefully again know that coal is the most polluting of all fossil fuels. And China gets 80% of its electricity from burning coal. India is 70% and the USA is 50%. So these big, huge economies are relying heavily on coal. So we need to think about how we can continue to use it in a less damaging way because lots of countries are not really willing to give up coal. So over the years, we've developed lots of technology that can replicate the way that Earth can store carbon dioxide, so underground in rock formations and in the oceans, for example. And this is called carbon capture and storage. It's often known as CCS. And it uses technology to capture that CO2 produced from the use of fossil fuels in electricity generation. And it's really, really useful. So it's possible to capture up to 90% of the CO2 that would either enter the atmosphere. So that's obviously a really positive thing. Once captured, the carbon gas is compressed and then it gets transported by a pipeline into an injection well, like you can see on the screen. That's injected as a liquid and it's popped into the ground to be stored in suitable geological reservoirs. So certain rock types can obviously store better than others. Now, estimates say that it could provide between 10% and 55% of global carbon mitigation. And the UK, in fact, is already a world leader in this, with the government stating that from 2020, it should be providing 20% of UK energy and saving us more than £30 billion a year. Although there's not really any more up-to-date figures than that, so we're not really sure whether that's happening or not yet. But it is expensive, and it's really, we're not overly sure about whether the CO2 will remain trapped in the long term. Many people also argue that actually we shouldn't really be focusing on carbon capture. We should be trying to eliminate all electricity generation using coal, and that's obviously a much more a much better approach. Okay, Duncan, can we have the next one up, please? So we're looking at planting trees, so reforestation or afforestation. So we know that deforestation is a major driver of climate change, and it is occurring currently at a rate of about 13 million hectares per year. We've talked about this a lot in previous sessions. So by planting trees, we can see a huge reduction in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, because trees act as carbon sinks and they remove that CO2 from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, and they also release moisture into the atmosphere, which has a cooling effect. It produces more cloud, and therefore it reduces incoming solar radiation, again decreasing climate change a bit more there. So plantation forests can absorb CO2 much faster than natural forests, and they do really effectively up to 50 years. Tree planting is established all over the world. It's a really simple solution, which obviously is what we're kind of looking for when we're looking at climate change mitigation right across the world. Right, the last one from me is international agreements, and I'm going to hand over to Suzanne in a minute. So we know that climate change is a global issue and it does need global solutions. There's no point doing something as one country when other countries are not. So as a global community, we regularly meet to have these big meetings to try and sort of thrash out all sorts of agreements about how we can fight climate change. So we know that carbon emissions spread across the world and they affect everyone. So every year, countries meet to agree targets to reduce global carbon emissions. So this is called these are the COP meetings, okay, the Conference of the Parties. So COP26 that we saw last year was a 26th meeting of these. This is a real challenge, though, to get people to agree, because some countries can afford to mitigate climate change more than others, and some are considered much more responsible for causing climate change more than others. Now, last year, COP26, which was held in Glasgow, was really important as it was seen as a last chance to agree a response before we do irreversible damage to the planet. Now, we did mention the Paris Agreement earlier. So this happened in 2015, where 195 countries across the world adopted the first ever universal and legally binding global climate deal. And they basically agreed to peak greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and to try and achieve a balance between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. They agreed to keep global temperatures increase below 2 degrees and try to limit them to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And they said they would review this every 5 years. So last year was a bit of a delay because of COVID. It should have been reviewed the year before. And they were also going to, they agreed to a package of $100 billion a year to support LICs, so those low-income countries, in their climate change initiatives, okay, which obviously is, again, really important to help those countries. So countries are now being told that they've got to reduce these, revise these targets to meet this 1.5 target. And this is our last chance. And by 2030, we really need to be down to 45% of the energy of the increase that we're currently seeing, and we need to be at net zero by 2050. Now, we're not quite on track yet. We're currently around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we need really to decrease those emissions every year by 7%. And to stay with that 1.5, we need to stop emitting carbon, and we need to get to this net zero as soon as possible. Right, I'm going to hand over to Suzanne, who's going to talk to you about adaptation techniques.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vicky. Right, so we're going to have a look here at adaptations, and we're going to start off with our changing agriculture. So scientists believe that climate change is going to actually have a really huge impact on agricultural systems across the entire world. These impacts include patterns of rainfall and of temperature changing. And you've probably can experience that and have heard about different changes and the concerns that we have in the UK. And as our we get more rainfall, more severe rainfall, we've had more heat waves, etc. An increase in the frequency and intensity of those weather events like heat waves, droughts, and floods. And the distribution of pests and diseases will change. So scientists predict that in the lower latitudes, rice production could fall in Southeast Asia. Remember, that's an area of hugely dense populations. But in mid-latitude areas, the warmer climate might actually see a rise, an increase in wheat yields, both across Europe and across North America. So farmers across the world will need to adapt to these changes. Now, there are lots of adaptations that farmers can make around the globe, such as introducing new cropping patterns, changing the planting or the sowing dates, where they actually plant their seeds or their sort of young crops, introduce drought-resistant strains of crops, so types of seeds that can cope with much drier conditions, although they can actually be quite expensive because often they've had some kind of technology put into them. Investing in new irrigation systems, again quite pricey, and educating themselves about water harvesting techniques, so collecting water, as well as planting trees to provide shade to protect seedlings from really strong sunshine. However, the cost of adapting to climate change is much, much more difficult for some of those poorer subsistence farmers in those low income countries. So it can be much more challenging for them to be able to switch effectively. And also, as you probably realise, there are going to be areas of very dense population which are actually going to experience a decline in the amount of food that they're producing. So obviously that's going to be very problematic in those areas. Right, can I have the next slide, please, Duncan? Wonderful. Right, so now we're going to have a look at managing water supply. So climate change is already causing more severe and more frequent droughts and also flood events. We've got more unreliable rainfall and periods of water shortage, which are now going to require much more careful management. Future climate change will affect the current patterns of our water supply, impacting on not only the quantity of our water, but also its quality. It's the most vulnerable, and particularly the rural parts of the poorer countries who are most likely to be affected. Again, those subsistence farmers. There are two ways to manage water supply. You can either reduce demand or you can increase supply. So, London, for example, a very wealthy city, is in the driest part of the UK in the southeast, but it has one of the highest demands for water. By 2030, all homes in London should have been offered a free retrofit. Retrofit means to be able to provide technologies which fit existing sort of appliances. So they're going to be giving a retrofit package of water efficient devices, so things for washing machines and dishwashers, to try to reduce the demand for water so that they use less and do the same job. In terms of increasing supply, London Thames Water have actually opened something called a desalinisation plant in Beckton. So it takes water from the River Thames when there's low tide, because that's when it's less salty. It's got more of the river water in it, and it uses reverse osmosis to turn that water into quality drinking water. However, the plant requires a lot of energy. Now, it actually, I had a little research of this online. It does say that it uses renewable energy on all its kind of on its website. However, when you kind of delve a little bit further, the renewable energy it's using is biodiesel and biofuels, which again are one of those kind of renewable fuels which sometimes people argue are using more energy to produce than they actually save. So there's more question marks about actually the sustainability of some of those biofuels and biodiesel. Looking then at that last point about low income countries and newly emerging economies, the way they can manage water supply tends to be much smaller scale in comparison to London, where it cost a lot of money. They needed, lots of technology. In these countries, it needs to be small scale, and it needs to be much cheaper. And a really good example of this is actually an artificial glacier project in Ladakh in India. So millions of people who live in this area depend on the rivers, which are all fed by the snow and glacial melt coming down from the mountains, for their domestic and their agricultural water supply. So they use it to drink and to water their crops. But in the Himalayas, most of the 16,000 glaciers are actually receding rapidly due to climate change, threatening that long-term water security of all those people who rely on that meltwater. So instead, they're collecting water in winter through a system of diversion canals and embankments, and that freezes, and they make artificial glaciers. So when this melts in the spring, it will provide enough water for all those local villages to both drink and to use to farm their crops. Right, I think we've got one more adaptation. Here we are. Yeah, the risk of rising sea levels. So our average sea level rises have been 20 centimetres since 1900. And by 2100, sea levels are expected to actually rise by a further 26 to 82 centimetres. 82 centimetres, that's quite a big depth across the globe. And obviously will impact different areas slightly differently. This will flood some of the most important agricultural land in very heavily populated countries like Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam. As sea levels rise, the rates of coastal erosion will also increase. Fresh water supplies in many of those countries will become contaminated by salt water, and the coastal areas will be much, much more prone to damage from storm surges. And I'm sure some of you are aware just how low-lying Bangladesh is. So any increase in sea rise and increase in storm surges could have catastrophic impacts for such a densely populated region of the world. One city at risk of sea level rise is, of course, somewhere we're more familiar with, London, okay, the capital city of the UK. It's currently well protected by something called the Thames Barrier. It was built in 1982, and it's actually had to be closed over 100 times since it's been built to stop tidal surges which come up the river from the North Sea, and it protects the those tidal surges from actually entering into central London, perhaps the area where the most economic damage and the most damage to kind of human life could occur. The barrier was designed with an expectation that it would be breached once in every 1,000 years. So that's it would be over, the water would go over the top of it only once every 1,000 years. But actually, because we've had a 50 centimetre rise in sea levels, that could increase the risk to once every 100 years. So arguably, with a really, really, really bad storm, a big storm surge, if the conditions are correct, then arguably there could be an overspill, even if that Thames Barrier goes up. There are other places that are far less resilient to sea level rise, and Maldives, sadly, is one example. As I had mentioned before, it's a group of tiny islands located in the Indian Ocean, quite stunning. But the highest point on the islands is 2.4 metres. So it's probably about the height of a room. The 380,000 inhabitants have a really uncertain future because sea level rise and climate models suggest that these islands are actually going to be uninhabitable by 2030. It's 8 years' time. That's not long. And completely submerged by 2070. The Maldivian government famously filmed an actual underwater cabinet meeting with the government all in scuba gear. Now, although it looked quite amusing, they were trying to tell the rest of the world about their plight. So that was over a decade ago. And they wanted everyone to understand just how serious it was for the Maldives. They're now focusing on quite a number of different mitigation strategies. So they're building seawalls. So they've got a 3-meter seawall constructed around the capital, Male, and they've got lots of sandbags used elsewhere. And you can see those on screen in the picture. They're building houses which are raised off the ground on stilts, particularly if there's any storm surges, they won't get damaged. And they're also restoring some of the coastal mangrove forests, as the tangled roots of those trees help trap sediment, and they do offer protection from storm waves. So they act as some kind of like a buffer. They're also constructing artificial islands at enormous cost, but they're making sure they're building them at over 3 meters high. So those predicted changes won't affect those new artificial islands. And they're relocating people that are most at risk. It's quite interesting to have a look at some time-lapse pictures of, I think it's called Mahali. I've probably pronounced that wrong. But the most dramatic strategy that they're considering is actually relocating their entire population. And they're looking at buying land in Sri Lanka or India, which seems very, very drastic. Right, I think that's finished us for the adaptation. So let's play a game. Over to Vicky.
Super. Well done. So we've obviously covered that all in lots of detail and all at once. So if you're still with us, then well done. So we're going to have a 60-second game of Categorise. So we've talked to you about mitigation strategies. We've talked to you about adaptation strategies. We want to check how well you've been listening, making sure that none of you have dozed off or abandoned us to go and have some, your dinner, for example. So we've got 8 strategies on the screen. You're going to have 60 seconds. You've just got to pop them in the correct column. So we don't want you typing the whole thing out. We just want numbers. So you can put M for mitigation, the numbers that go with it, and then A for adaptation, the numbers that go with that. So Duncan, can we have a minute on the clock, please? Thank you very much. If you are watching on catch up, obviously, if you need a bit more time, then just pause. So we've got building homes that are raised off the ground, more air conditioning in homes, international agreements, building the seawalls and flood barriers, enhancing natural carbon sinks, carbon capture from fossil fuel power stations, electric vehicles and charging points, and changing to drought-resistant crops. You don't need to do them all at once. You can do them coming up. You can put them in the chat separately, like we've got a couple of people doing at the moment. Well done. I think all the ones that are coming up at the moment are correct. Okay, good. We've got some really interesting things coming through the chat. Well done, those of you that are joining in. So can we have the answers up on the screen, please, Duncan? Thank you. So our mitigation, our carbon capture number 6, 5, enhancing those natural sinks, 3, international agreements, and 7, electric vehicles and charging points, and then adaptation, 1, 4, 8, and 2. So building homes, raised off the ground, building the seawalls, change into drought-resistant crops, and more air conditioning in homes. Well done. Right, I'm going to hand back to Suzanne for a bit of exam practice and exam gold.
Thank you. Okay, so here you can see the question. Explain why low-income countries and newly emerging economies might struggle to manage the impacts of climate change. And that's a 4-mark question. This will be level marked. So have a think how you would approach this. Now, we often suggest that one of the best ways is to bug the question. That is boxing the command word. So in this case, have a think what you think the command word is. Hopefully you got it. It's explain. That means give reasons why. So we're looking here at giving reasons why some of those less wealthy countries might find it quite difficult to either manage in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change. Why might they find it more difficult? What is it about there's some of those mitigations and adaptations which might make it harder for those low-income countries and newly emerging economies to be able to so I'm really sorry, my words aren't coming out to me. To implement some of those. Right. If we could have the next slide, please, Duncan. Thank you. Right. So what you would need to think about is some of the mitigations and some of the adaptations. Now, I would advise it's always quite good practice with, even with these 4-mark questions, to just jot down a couple of words of planning before you start your answer. So in this case, you might want to recall a couple of mitigation or adaptation strategies, and particularly think of the ones which you think might be more difficult for those poorer countries to afford. So thinking about some of those mitigations, carbon capture that Vicky talked about, that uses really sophisticated technology, and it's actually extremely expensive because it's in its infancy. It's still a very, very pricey technique. So that could be one that you might mention. An adaptation, which might be more challenging for less wealthy countries, would be, for example, moving people away, like Maldives are having to consider, because you've got to buy new land. That's not cheap. Or some of those things that they're doing, the cost of sea defences and building up land to try and cope with rising sea levels, that's enormously expensive. So it could be you pick ones which you know are going to best exemplify why those low-income countries and newly emerging economies are going to struggle to implement them. Right, Duncan, can we have the next one, please? So our exam gold. So because it's a 4-marker, as I said before, it's level marked. So it's not 4 individual points, but what is always good practice is to have 2 clear ideas that you elaborate, so you develop. So potentially one idea about mitigation. Remember, I've just mentioned perhaps carbon capture is a good one. And the other one about adaptation. Don't forget that the question mentions those low-income countries and newly emerging economies. So it's really vital that you talk about economic development, you talk about how wealth or the fact that they don't have enough money might affect their ability to put some of those mitigations or adaptations in place. So how does less wealth affect their resilience? However, you could do one if you did it very, very, very well. I would probably say 2 ideas, and then you've kind of belt and braces, you've got yourself covered. Right, I think that's it. We're on to Vicky with some stepping stones.
Super. So I've kind of in this activity, I have looked at one way, because I know sometimes people struggle, students panic in exams, they can't think of 2 ways. So if you really have to, and you have to rely on one, you do need to make sure that your chains of analysis are as good as they possibly can be. So let's have a look at how we can develop those. So we have stepping stones task here. We want to complete that chain of analysis that answers that question that we just had up on the screen. So we have the first part of our answer and the last part of our answer. We just need to fill in the 2 missing boxes. So we've got people living in LICs and NEEs often struggle to have a decent quality of life, particularly in terms of food and water supply. Then we've got 2 missing boxes, and at the end it says this may lead to more people becoming sick and not being able to work, therefore quality of life becomes worse for those already struggling. Now, actually, you could argue that those 2 together would make an answer. Not a particularly good answer, and it's an answer that doesn't really reference anything that we've been talking about in this session. So let's have a think about how we could make this a much better answer. Now, if you are watching on catch up, then pause it and have a think, maybe jot down a few ideas about what you might do for stepping stones 2 and 3. But we're going to show you now what sort of level of detail we're looking for to get that 4 marker. Okay, so we have stepping stone 2. An increase in temperature and more frequent droughts mean there will be less drinking water, but also less water for irrigation. So the fact that we've got the increase in temperatures there is obviously making reference to climate change. So less irrigation means that crops may fail, meaning that people will have less to eat, and that may lead to famine. This may lead to more people becoming sick, not being able to work, so therefore quality of life becomes worse for those already struggling. Now, In the chat, we've got a couple of really good answers coming through. So well done, Pink. If soil becomes infertile due to drought, then lack of crop growth may cause famine. Fantastic. Really good answer there. So that's the level of detail that we are looking for. Right, our last activity to end the session is with Suzanne, and we've got some quick multiple choice questions.
Wonderful. Okay, yeah, these are quick. So if you can pop in the chat box your answers. So number one, the main impact of sea level rise is A, is it the changed levels of precipitation? That's rainfall. B, increased river flooding. C, increased surface runoff from rivers. Or D, increased coastal flooding. So let's see if you can get that in the chat box. If you're playing at home, just jot it down. So the main impact of sea level rise. We've talked quite a lot about this. Think about that the poor Maldives. Right, Duncan, can we have a reveal? Oh, well done. I've got a few answers coming through. Oh, I didn't have the answer come up there. There we go. Increased coastal flooding. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Right. Okay. Question number 2. Here we go. A consequence of rising sea temperatures is it A, fewer tropical storms, B, increasing fish populations, C, more pollution, or D, coral bleaching? We have mentioned this tonight. So which one of those do you think it is? Well done, Pink. Can we have a reveal, please, Duncan? Wonderful. Thank you. That's D, the coral bleaching, remember. Right, number 3. Which one of the following is not an impact of decreasing crop yields? Is it A, increased population density, B, malnutrition, C, death, D, famine? So what is not an impact? What do you reckon there? Oh, yeah, we've got some great answers coming through, some correct answers. Well done, Domas. Well done, Pink. A. Number 4, please, Duncan. Which one of the following is not a carbon mitigation strategy? Is it A, carbon capture storage, B, afforestation, C, developing renewable energy sources, or D, building coastal defences? So what do you reckon here? A, B, C, or D? Pop it down if you're playing at home. I can see I've got some answers coming through already. Well done, Domas. Fastest off there, and you've got it correct. So Duncan, can you do the reveal? Well done. It's D. It's building coastal defences. All the rest, look, are ways in which we reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Question number 5. Which one of the following is a renewable source of energy? Is it A, coal, B, wind power, C, oil, D, gas? Hopefully all of you are going to get this right. Okay, so which one is of the following? Waiting to get some through. Let's see on the live chat. Right, well done. A whole plethora of them. Right, can we have the reveal? Yeah, wind power. Thank you very much. Remember, all the others are fossil fuels, so non-renewables. Which of the following is not an adaptation strategy to deal with rising sea levels? Is it A, developing flood warning systems, B, building coastal defences, C, developing renewable energy, or D, building levees, which are earth embankments at the coast? So which one of those do you think is not an adaptation strategy to deal with those rising sea levels? Well done, Pink. Thank you. Let's have a reveal, Duncan. Indeed, it is C. Right, whipping on to question number 7. One way in which farming practices can adapt to climate change is by A, signing international agreements, B, developing new crop varieties more resistant to dry weather, increasing the planting of crops, or importing more crops from overseas. What do we reckon to this one? Right. Have we got any? Can we have the reveal, please, Duncan? B. Okay, so this is developing new crop varieties more resistant to dry weather. So looking at how different, sometimes they collect crops that have kind of gone from very old kind of traditional varieties, and sometimes they use technology to develop new strains. Right, Number 8, which one of the following is not an effective method to conserve water? Is it A, building more dams, B, harvesting rainwater, C, installing water meters, or D, installing swimming pool covers to reduce evaporation? Okay, so which one do you think that is? Last question. Okay, right. Have we got anything coming through? I think Thomas, yeah. Right. Building more dams. Okay, it's not an effective way to conserve water. All the other ones are. Right. Vicky, do you want to do the additional support or shall I?
I'm happy to do it. So if you need any extra help, there is plenty of stuff on the GTVU website. So we've got there's flashcards that you can see up on the screen. There's all sorts of things. We've got MCQs, lots of them for every single topic, which I think Suzanne actually wrote, and they are very good. We've got work booklets, and we've got all of the other sessions that we've done, and we're up to about probably 30 to 40 of them now. So please have a look and join us after half term, where we are going to be looking at sustainable management of the rainforest.
Okay, thanks everyone. Very well done. Some great contributions in the chat window. And it's definitely tea time now, so we'll let you get off. Is it no session next week? Is that right?
Yeah, no session next week because, well, actually Suzanne is back at work next week, aren't you? But I'm on half time next week, so I've made an executive decision that we're not going to have one next week.
Okay. If you found the session useful, please do click the thumbs up to show that. It makes us happy, and also it helps other students find the sessions. And also, if you haven't already, do subscribe to the channel, and then you'll find out about future sessions. Okay, thanks guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.